Who we are is more important than what we do. That's not what we're taught. That's probably not what we believe. That's definitely not the way that we generally operate as humans. But who we are is more important than what we do. What we do is important. The things that we engage in our everyday lives, the ways that we come together as a community of faith and we serve, whether it's our community or whether we serve internally, all of those things are important. But the things that we do overflow out of who we are. It reminds me of that story where Jesus is encountered by this group of religious people who are worried about him and his disciples engaging in these purity acts of washing their hands before they eat. And I always laugh whenever I read that story because I think it's still important for everybody to wash your hands before you eat, okay? But the point that Jesus is trying to make in that moment is that what's going on inside of us is really the most important thing, because what's inside of our hearts is what comes out. And it makes me kind of think of us as a vessel that's being poured out for God. Is that vessel clean? Is it healthy? Is it safe? Who we are is more important than what we do. We're taught to do, we're taught to engage, we're taught to be busy, we're taught to stay busy because this is something that we can kind of measure in our culture. We can measure busyness. People can see us keeping a busy schedule and working really, really hard. And it's a value, it's a badge of honor that we wear. But how much do we really value this idea of being? This idea of working on ourselves, stopping from engaging in action and allowing ourselves to be still long enough to hear God, so that we can make the changes in our lives that God wants us to make. And the truth is, if you're like me, I like staying busy because it's a good distraction from being still. Whenever I'm still, I have to start catching up with my thoughts. Whenever I'm still and I'm quiet, I have to start processing the things that maybe I've been putting off for a while. I have to look in the mirror and acknowledge the person that I am becoming. And sometimes it's easier just to keep going and going and going. And I think that's what we see in the story of Elijah. In some ways, it's a tragic story. This guy, he gives up hope. He becomes completely hopeless. He doesn't even want to live anymore. But I also think that depending on the way that we read it, it's kind of a story of comedy. You know, the old-fashioned comedies where they would speed things up, make everything go twice as fast. We see this picture of this guy, Elijah, going at warp speed. And he's frustrated, he's concerned because it looks like the world around him is falling apart. It looks like his country is falling apart. It looks like his religion and his faith is all falling apart. And he's feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders, like he's responsible, like he's the one who has to hold it all together. And in those moments when we feel like we've got to hold it all together, how often do we stop? How often do we pause? How often do we just sit with the silence to listen? We don't when we think it's up to us. And so we have this picture of this prophet Elijah who's kind of wringing his hands. He's hysterical because he thinks that he's the only faithful person left, and he now thinks that God has even abandoned him. And so he goes out into the wilderness, and you know what God tells him to do? God tells him to take a nap and eat a snack. Seriously, go back, read 1 Kings chapter 19. God tells him to take a nap and eat a snack. I mean, he is tired and he is hangry, all right? He needs to take a break because like that little wind-up doll that just keeps going and going and going, he has tunnel vision. All he can see is the absolute worst case scenario. He's completely lost his perspective of reality. He's completely lost his perspective of God, and God is saying, Elijah, chill out. Take a break. Eat a snack. Take a nap. And then when he wakes up, he stands out on this cleft of a rock, and there are these natural phenomenon that go by, a strong wind, an earthquake, and a fire, which might symbolize our expectation of how we think that God operates, like in these really powerful, obvious ways. But the scriptures tell us that God wasn't in any of those things. Instead, God is in the thin, quiet sound. The Hebrew word there might even suggest silence. God is not in the chaos. God is in the silence. And that's when he hears what we sometimes call the still small voice. And God tells Elijah what he needs to do. After all of this, it's not going to be Elijah who goes back to save the day. He's not going to be the hero. He's not going to help his country turn around from their idolatry and move in the right direction. It's not about Elijah. Instead, God is calling Elijah to go back and to anoint these individuals, King Hazael, and it's actually King Hazael who brings the reform to the nation of Israel. It's King Hazael who is the leader, the catalyst for bringing an end to idolatry, for tearing down all the altars of the idols. It's not Elijah. He had a role, he had a part in all of it, but because he was so busy wringing his hands, because he was so busy trying to figure out how he was going to hold it all together, because he was so consumed by all the noise and all the chaos that was going on around him, and because he wasn't stopping and being still and listening, he couldn't hear what his role in God's plan was. And if you can't see yourself in this story, then I'd love to talk to you afterwards to see what you're doing in your life that makes you so successful. Because it's a caricature of us, right? I mean, hopefully I'm not alone. This is all of us. And what I see happening in this story with Elijah is so important. Such an important spiritual practice, because when he's standing there with that thin silence, listening for God, I think what Elijah is doing, and this is kind of abstract, it's kind of hard for us to even imagine, but he's taking himself out of the equation. Now think about that for a moment. Think about the problems or the challenges that you are facing in your life. Think about the things that are worrying you. the things that weigh upon your mind, that keep you awake at night. And for one moment, instead of figuring out how you're going to solve all of those things, imagine what that scenario would look like if you removed yourself. That's what's happening with Elijah. And in that moment, maybe he's realizing that he's his biggest problem. That he needs to step out and take a break so that he can reflect, so that God can speak to him. Because who we are is more important than what we do. And Elijah is, in that moment, up to that moment, he's operating out of a really unhealthy place in his life. Who he is not a healthy person. And so anything that he tries to do is going to probably be pretty toxic. But in that moment of silence, he removes himself from the equation. And you know what happens when we do that? We see God. And we no longer see ourselves as the person who's trying to fix and solve everything, but we're leaving it up to God. And maybe God has a role for us in that situation, and maybe God doesn't. I think the story is leading us to this point that our lives, our communities are going to be a mess if we don't spend just as much time working on who we are as we do working on what we do. This text comes from the lectionary, and I thought it was pretty appropriate because here we are in the season of vacationing, and I'm thankful for your faithful attendance in worship during the summer. I know that there are other opportunities to do other things, and it is important to get away and spend time with your family and your friends and enjoy life and take a break. Yeah, go do that. But come back to church too. And in those times when you are at the beach or in the mountains, that is a spiritual experience, an opportunity to disengage from all of the stuff that you're doing and to listen for the still, small voice. To glance over your life and look at the areas that worry you the most and concern you the most. Take yourself out of the equation and ask, when I get back to work, when I get back to church, whenever I get back into the rhythm of things, what is God actually calling me to do in each of those situations? Maybe you're not going to be the person who resolves anything, but maybe you're going to be an influence of someone else who will, like in the case of Elijah. Now, I want to say one more thing, because I think it's pertinent to the story and pertinent to the way that we think about God in general. We might wonder, why is God like this? Why doesn't God reveal God's self more like through the wind and the fire and the earthquake? Why isn't God's presence and God's revelation more obvious? But have you ever been in a crowded space where there are lots of people talking, lots of background noise, and then you hear some kind of like little faint buzz in the background, and you have to go around going, shh, everybody. Turn down the stereo, turn off the TV. Everybody, end your conversations. I'm trying to figure out where this little humming sound is coming from. Have you ever been there? Trying to figure out, what is that, my smoke detector? What is going on here? And I think the idea here is that James, in his epistle, he says, draw near to God and God will draw near to us. Come close to God and God will come close to us. And I think that it's this idea of when we are willing to give God our undivided attention, we can hear God a lot better. And the truth is that humming sound, that still small voice, it's always there. God is always wanting to speak into our lives. But it's so incredibly important for us to stop, to cut out all of the noise, to give God our undivided attention, to let God work on us. This biblical idea of taking a break, it comes to us in the form of Sabbath, which is not something that Christians do very well at all. Jewish people, they were very observant about taking this day off to be holy. And this week, as I was reflecting on this text, on this story, and what this really looks like in my own life, I began to think about the fact that Sabbath is really taking a break from some of the work that we do to work on ourselves, which is sometimes the hardest work that we do. To enter the quiet, to deal with the emotions and the feelings and the thoughts that we've been putting off, that we've allowed to put off to the side with all of the distractions. And when we stop and enter the silence to listen to that still small voice, to listen to God speak, we have to start working through that baggage in our lives of the person who we are becoming. Who we are is more important than what we do. That's true of you in your individual walk of life. It's true for us as a church. Who we are is more important than what we do. Let me say it one more time, because when we leave this place, that's not what our society is going to tell us. Who we are is more important than what we do. Let's pray.